No unity, no power.
White power for white people. Black power for black people. 1967. The Black Panther Party. The movement.
Let's talk about freedom.
When the college was, when the advocacy for the college started back in 1963, it was because the community felt that it really needed to have a four-year institution in this community. But at that time, the powers to be said, and this is written in the history, and I put it in quotes, we're not putting a college in that slump. But look at where we have come. So this college came out of the advocacy of the community, and we were established with social justice in our DNA. And it is so important today because of what is going on in this nation. We have a work to continue to do in the vein of social justice. And coming here, before coming, I looked at how hard this community was hit by the pandemic. And this college, because of its social justice mission, played a significant role in this community as it relates to what was going on during the pandemic. We provided food, not just for our students, but we provided food for this community. Had it not been, however, for a social worker, Dr. Wally Boone, I'm not sure that And the reason I say that, he was here when other people were at home. And some people would come out to help him, but he was here. And so when I first met him, he talked about how he would even go to the homes of students if they could not get here to take them groceries. To me, that is a person who really cares about the work. So please, let's give this But I was looking at how so many people were affected health-wise, and for a number of years have been involved in health disparities research. But coming to Medgar Evers, I said it's time for us to really not to stop doing the research, we continue to research. We know that the disparities exist. The pandemic exacerbated that. And so I said, we need to look at health equity. And so I have been on this mantra of health equity since I have been here. And so we are doing some things as it relates to that to try to get a more focus on our community as it relates to health. And even though we are a college, a higher education institution, I said we are not going to be that college that's going to be in the community as a location. We are going to be a college that is actually going to be involved in helping to uplift and turn around those things in the community that need attention. And just know that Medgar Evers College is a place that should be the destination for anybody from this community when they are looking for a college that is truly going to care about them, about their future. And so I'm not going to stand up here and say that I don't want you all also to send us students. Thank you.
There is a public health emergency. I don't know if you're aware, but Black people are dying. Yes. People of color are dying. The leading cause of death in the young population, ages 18 to 24, accidental deaths and suicide. And both of these deaths are really occurring at the hands of guns. We see from some CDC data that across from 10 up until around 34 years old, Black men are dying from homicide and suicide. It's a serious health emergency. And there are many reasons as to why this is happening here in this country, specifically, which is not occurring in other countries around the world. There is this civil rights and also equity activist in St. Louis who's doing some work and research on Black male suicide. There's a 33% increase of suicide in the USA, but not in any of the other industrialized countries. And rates of suicide for Black males have been peaking, right, for the ages of 20 to 24. So take a look at that number. Rates of suicide for young people, 20 to 24, is on the increase, it's peaking. For whites, rates of suicide peak between 50 and 59 years old. That means that young people may feel as though they don't have a future because they're dying very, very early, right? There are many contributors to early suicide that we don't necessarily see in the majority population. Black male masculinity makes it very difficult for people to access services, right? You're a Black male, you're supposed to be strong, you know, you can't be telling the people your business, it can only stay within the family. You're weak if you access mental health services, people are gonna prey upon you. That is a big problem, that's a cultural problem, which the warriors are gonna have to help us to take care of. Not accessing mental health services, what does that do, right? It leads to us not being able to receive culturally responsive treatment from people with lived experience, such as yourselves. We not only bring what we've learned in the academic institution to the table, but your lived experience as a person of color is very powerful. And the things that they didn't teach you in the classroom are the things that you need to bring to the patients that you're serving. The young woman who was up here speaking before was speaking about food and nutrition, about healing services. People of color, we respond well to healing and wellness, maybe as opposed to focusing on mental illness. And that's what I'm going to charge you with today. Having a strength-based approach at addressing some of these problems that are not entirely created by the person or the family, but really created by a system of government, of institutions that want to keep us in an inferior realm. Let's not forget about trauma. Trauma can induce shame in people. So has anyone treated people with post-traumatic stress disorder? We know that people who have PTSD are victimized. There's a lot of shame that's associated with being a victim, especially if it involves sexual violence. There's a lot of avoidance of talking about it, even avoidance of seeking treatment because it causes so much distress. The intergenerational consequences of slavery lead to the post-traumatic slavery syndrome, which is akin to PTSD. People are hypervigilant. I see somebody raising their hand and they've heard of it. People are irritable. People can get anxious, depressed, panic-stricken. And when they see a cop approach, and it can remind them of an authoritarian who could perhaps take advantage of them, that's a problem for us. These factors of shame, of trauma, access to guns, can lead to increased suicide, especially amongst our young people. You know, because of social media, young people feel as though they've shifted their attitudes towards suicide, right? It's not as taboo as it was maybe in the 50s and 60s. They're gonna go out with a bang. There's a lot more hopelessness or faithlessness, not connected to churches or faith-based organizations, being locked inside for the past 3 years, 4 years, with COVID-19. Those are problems. And also, racism and discrimination is a significant factor to contribute to the devaluing of someone's self-esteem and pushing people towards feeling like their life isn't worth living, so that they should take their lives. Childhood trauma specifically can cause children to have these acting out behaviors. So you might get a call, you might have children get a call from the teacher saying your kid is acting out, or other kids are acting out at school. They don't necessarily take the time to speak to the kid, because they're also a black kid, a Latinx kid. They got their own problems, and they don't want to learn. That's really not the case. There's a culminating and accumulation of traumatic experiences that are interwoven in our DNA that can contribute to behavioral disturbances in classrooms and can appear to be criminalistic, right? Because social media tells us that people of color, young kids of color, who may engage in some behaviors that other kids might engage in, are considered criminalistic behaviors. We know better than that. Suicide trends have been increasing amongst elementary school members. You can see the data here. Suicide rates have increased for children as young as 5 years old. Can you imagine that? As young as 5. You heard about that, right? I see you raising your hand over there. That's right. 5 years old. She needs a candy. Where's that ambassador, son? There was a substantial increase in suicide rates among young adolescent black males. Substantial increase. So significant that the CDC had done a survey and they put out a paper. It was called the Ring the Alarm paper. And as a result of that, New York State Office of Mental Health established a Black Youth Suicide Initiative to help figure out, well, how can we mitigate the risk of suicide amongst Black youth? We see that gun violence, right, is particularly responsible for completed suicides for our young people of color. There are firearms in the streets of Harlem, of Bronx, of Brooklyn. People get access to guns where it's not the same in other neighborhoods. These are significant factors that lead to the untimely death of our people. And of course, race and gun violence, sometimes young people don't intend to kill themselves, but they do it accidentally, right? They may have the gun, they may be holding it, they might have it on the desk, and it goes off, and that's an accidental suicide. So even accidental death by guns is significant. So I wanted to move in and talk with you a little bit about race, and I know that race is a really big issue. We're talking about health equity, and of course, race is the fundamental issue which leads to health inequity for the BIPOC community. So what is race? It's a socially constructed system of categorizing human beings. It's not biologically based at all. As a matter of fact, somebody said, I'm going to look at you and I'm going to determine who you are by how you look. And I'll tell you a little bit about who that person is. This systematic categorization of human beings has led to Black people and Latinx people being dehumanized. You're not human. Therefore, if you're not human, I don't have to respect you and preserve your dignity because you're not human. The race is really based on how you look. Your hair texture, your skin complexion, your facial features. Simply as that. Somebody can look at you and make a determination about who you are based on how you look. Can you imagine he's the culprit here? This is Carl Linnaeus. Now, this man is from Sweden, and he was a botanist. He worked mostly with plants and vegetation. He is known as the father of taxonomy. He decided that he was going to create a system of classifying and categorizing human beings. Can you imagine that? Somebody working with plants in the 1700s decided to do that. We're in 2023, but we're still following his lead. He came up with these 4 different types of races. As I said, this is a socially constructed categorization of human beings. There's really no biological foundation for this at all. All right? So, the 4 categories. You have the Asian man, you have the American Indian man, and look at the descriptors. Obstinate, okay? It means that they're stubborn. Married, free. They're regulated by customs. Then you have Asiaticus, the Asian. In some places they call it Mongolian, which is a very offensive term. They're melancholy. Avaricious means that they're greedy for wealth. and ruled by opinions. Then you have Afrikaners, to black people, and they're relaxed, crafty, in other words, you might say they're slick, negligent, and they're governed by caprice. Means their mood and their behavior shifts at the drop of a dime, no rhyme or reason. They are unpredictable and dangerous. And then you have the European, white. They're muscular, gentle, inventive, and governed by laws. Have people heard this before? Can you imagine this man came up with this in the 1700s? And we still haven't learned. We're still using that today. We know better. His human classification was based on the same work that he did with plants and vegetables. He looked at the skin color, the temperament, physical traits, the behavior, and some of the clothing and the form of government. There it goes again. Pay attention. All right. And since we're talking about race, I have a slide in about critical race theory, right? Critical race theory. Don't believe what they're saying in Florida or in the other states. Critical race theory is a philosophical ideology which is discussed in law schools, not in high school, not in middle school, not in elementary school. Now, they are looking at some of the structures that might contribute to disproportionate law enforcement practices, okay? That's critical race theory. It's not American history, it's not talking about slavery, it's not talking about, people coming over the Atlantic. It's something that's really unique and focused, but people have got this term confused. There's this one person, he used to be in office a few years ago, up in Washington, D.C., talked a lot about that, but I think he got it confused. So what is racism? Racism is treating people unfairly because of the color of their skin or other physical characteristics, really based on what Carl Linnaeus talked about. And it posits that one race is better than the other. You can't do that. It's something that's socially constructed. How can you say one race is better than the other just because of the way someone looks? It just doesn't make sense. Racism comes under bias. We hear a lot about bias, how we view and understand people in the world. And if you didn't realize it, if you got a brain, you have bias. There are biological principles which help us in discernment and making determinations of threats. So if you look at the animals, go on a safari, the zebra hanging out with the zebras, the wild boars are hanging out with the wild boars, the jaguars are hanging out with the jaguars. And that is because they, as species, have very primitive thinking, and they look at things that are different to determine if it's predator or prey. But for human beings, we've evolved. We have language, we have connection, we speak, we're cooperative. Just because I look different than you doesn't mean that I'm a threat to you. But that's what bias does for people. When we think about prejudice, think of prejudice as an idea, a thought. I'm making a judgment about someone without even having all the facts. I'm looking at you, like Carl Linnaeus, he was prejudiced. He made a judgment about people without really knowing the facts. Discrimination, on the other hand, takes it a step further. It goes from the idea to the action. How do I use my preconceived ideas about someone to either treat them differently or unfairly? It's an action-oriented concept. But one of the most dangerous of the biases is implicit bias. Neuroscience teaches us that the unconscious is very powerful and is most at play. And it is your unconscious which contributes to the discrimination and bias that might come through in the way that you're treating a patient in your office, or in a hospital setting, or in a clinic. You're not even aware of it. It's happening while you're speaking. And there are a lot of things that influence implicit bias. See this picture? Guys hanging out on the stoop, chilling out, This is a stereotypical picture, an image of young men of color. It's all over social media, all over the news, sometimes also on the billboards around here. And it will have you believe that these people who are just sitting down are dangerous. Okay? That contributes to the implicit, unconscious bias that you have. You're flooded with images and experiences that are a bit distorted. And of course, we know that these biases in this country have led to people of color being oppressed, being unfairly taken advantage of, locked out of certain housing environments, locked out of certain schools, not having access to certain job titles, because you've been deemed at the bottom of the rung. I've been deemed to be at the bottom of the rung and have been oppressed by a system, as Michael Jackson said, they don't really care about us. Racial oppression is a traumatic form of bias and discrimination. And you can speak to people who've been in the Jim Crow South who can tell you a lot about that. In fact, oppression was so prominent here in the United States. I don't know if people are aware, but Adolf Hitler sent Nazi Germans to come to the American South, to Alabama and Mississippi, to learn about Jim Crow and how they used oppressive tactics to keep Black people in check. And they decided to do the same thing in Germany with Jewish people. So this is how powerful that this oppression is. Up here in the slide, you notice that there's something called the privilege power wheel. You can Google this, take a look at it. So this wheel really focuses on the intersectionality of identities that allows people to have access to privileges and allows others to not have access to it at all. And if you look at it, if you're closest to the center, you're closest to privilege and power. So who's at closest? Protestant, Catholic, able-bodied, US-born, English-speaking, ruling, wealthy, white, male, heterosexual. They got the most power. Who's at the periphery? Native American, African American, intersex, people on welfare, foreign-born, no English, mental disability, right? Muslim, Buddhist, pansexual. These people on the periphery and don't have access to the resources. And ultimately, it leads to premature and early deaths for people, as I'll tell you a little bit more about as the story unfolds. So, here is just another example of the contrast of social images, right? Carl Linnaeus started that in the 1700s. It continues today. I thought we would learn by now. Black people are poor, violent, religious, lazy, cheerful when they have libations, and dangerous. And then white people, wealthy, progressive, conventional, stubborn, successful, and educated. Now, how is that? Okay, it just doesn't make sense. Again, just a little bit more information about stigma. Stigma talks about prejudice and discrimination, especially against the mentally ill. So, although race is not real, racism is very real. There's many different types of racism. There's individual racism and interpersonal racism that happens between people on the individual level. There's institutional racism, which has to do with different institutions, the educational system, the housing system, criminal legal system, not criminal justice, because there's no justice and no peace for people of color. And then what I really want to focus on is really structural racism, and this is how the social justice warriors can really help us out. So when someone comes into your office or into your clinic with no housing, they only, went to the 6th grade in school and they have public assistance, we have to be mindful of the structural components to these people's condition. There are many systems that contributed to these people of color being where they are. It's not simply because of the decisions that they made. It was because of choices that they had access to or lack thereof. So we see structural racism in the United States in many different institutions. housing discrimination, redlining, real estate steering, restrictive covenants, food deserts, right? Block busting, the Federal Housing Act, Fair Housing Act, all those contributed to segregation for people of color. And those are structures that can contribute to someone being homeless or the homelessness leading them to exhibiting symptoms of a mental health condition. Education and employment, not having access to good schools. You can bring it up. Not having access to good schools. Discrimination by teachers, unequal school funding. Makes it very difficult for people to get an education, to be challenged, to be enriched, to be inspired, and to believe in a future. That's what lack of education and employment can do. The criminal legal system, unlawful and disproportionate law enforcement practices in neighborhoods of people who are black and brown. So how many times have you heard, black and brown kids having weed on them in the street in the Bronx? They're subjected to stop and frisk. They're brought in, get a ticket, get arrested. But in other communities in the suburbs, there's Percocet, there's heroin, there's weed, there's crystal meth, and guess what? Ain't nobody going to jail. All right? That's what's happening. That is the criminal legal system. It is unfair and really unlawful. And then I must tell you, healthcare also perpetuates health inequity. And one of the reasons that it happens is because of our own biases. We all have bias. If you got a brain, you have bias. And it's unconscious. So I am fed those negative messages about myself and my people as well. And I have to be very mindful of that. I have to be very deliberate to dismantle the anti-black racism that I've been taught all of my life. I have to be very mindful of that. And I'm going to challenge you to do the same. You can't look at somebody who's coming from Rikers Island and saying, he's violent, he don't matter, let me get him out, he's a nuisance. No, there are many reasons why this young man is in the position that he's in today. You have to understand that, okay? During COVID-19, they were talking about people of color dying from COVID. There are many reasons as to why that happened. But the health inequities due to the medical providers not being proximal to the communities of color that they're serving, dehumanizing the communities of color, limiting access to resources that are life-saving for people who were not of color, led to many deaths of black and brown people during COVID-19. But the lack of physicians of color or providers of color started in the early 1900s. Again, another man in the US, Dr. Flexner, he decided to come up with a report and said, you know what, in 1910, he changed medical education for the next 100 plus years. He said there were too many medical schools that were training black doctors. And that would be too much of a problem for the white physician. So he put out a report in 1910 that basically closed all the HBCU medical schools, except for two, Howard University and Meharry Medical College. Those were the only ones. Now, black people weren't allowed to go to a non-HBCU medical school until the late 1950s. So from 1910 to 1957 or 1958, if you were a person of color and you wanted to go to medical school, there were only two schools in the United States that could accept you. That was Howard and Meharry. There began the disproportionate amounts of physicians of color who were able to provide the best care for people of color. So, privilege. People want to hold on to their privileges, right? Privileges are very validating. In this country, you don't have to do anything to get privilege. You just have to maybe be of a certain race, and that's how that works, okay? I'm going to talk with you a little bit about racial trauma because it's important. Many people of color here in this country are descendants of slaves. I am one of them. and the intergenerational trauma and the neurobiological consequences. So racial trauma definition: emotional and physical symptoms often experienced by people of color, Black families specifically, due to everyday occurrences such as microaggressions and racism. And there's a cumulative effect of that. So if we're seeing it on the news, we're hearing it on the radio, we're seeing it at the stop signs on the street, that young Black males or females have been stopped by police, harassed, or even killed, that is exposure to racial trauma. It can be very triggering. We saw many of these images, for the past few years, right? There's Tamir Rice, there's Trayvon Martin, there's Ahmaud Arbery, and there's Breonna Taylor. All of these individuals, young people, very innocent, were killed at the hands of law enforcement or of vigilante Americans. Racial trauma never ends. We're constantly being bombarded with it. We're constantly being put in our place. And there's a certain amount of voyeurism that occurs with that. So you'll see there's a lot of media sensationalism behind Black people and Latinx people being traumatized. And it reminds me of the lynchings that happened in the early 1900s and late 1800s during Jim Crow South. There's a voyeuristic quality for people watching one person or groups of people being killed or harmed. And there's a collective, characteristic of trauma, which we all experience and can lead to the soul wounds that we're all suffering from. Soul wounds are historical trauma and the cumulative psychological wounds that result from post-traumatic slavery syndrome and other traumatic experiences. Colonization, genocide, slavery, being dislocated, right? So those are all contributing to soul wounds. So this is what happens to a typical functioning brain when they're exposed to something traumatic or scary. You see the stimulus, the amygdala starts to work in the brain, you have a response that's fight or flight or freeze, and then your hippocampus will store the memory of that exposure. But then the brain impacted by trauma, specifically complex trauma, is a bit different. There's a reminder, it's a tree that's waving in the wind, makes a sound. The amygdala becomes activated and releases chemicals in the brain. And then the response again is fight or flight or freeze. And then this time, the hippocampus doesn't store it, and it doesn't help to inhibit the response. So people are in distress all the time. So you have little kids who might hear a sound, a door slam, a car screeching, someone yelling, and it triggers this fight or flight response. These are neurobiological consequences of trauma, slavery, racism, and discrimination. And these reactions can be misinterpreted by law enforcement. They stop a kid, the kid sees the cop, gets nervous what's going to happen, gets anxious, and the policeman mischaracterizes the young person and says, you know what? He's dangerous, or she's dangerous, and they're going to attack me, and I have to respond and take care of myself. Of course, trauma has an impact on brain development. It distorts thinking, causes cognitive bias, and also causes the lack of development of the brain, and it impairs learning. So, if you didn't know, discrimination has an effect on health. And what it does is, it can really age Black people and people of color. In your brain, you have something called a telomere, which is the end point of the DNA that's in your brain. And what happens is, when you're exposed to microaggressions, trauma, there is a breakdown of the telomere, the ends of your DNA. And as a result, it causes something called the weathering effect, premature aging for people of color. I got a lot of gray hair, right? So, there's a lot of trauma that's being kind of like, coming from a lot of different institutions that we're all exposed to. And that can lead to our premature death. And it also is a major driver of inflammation. If you get inflammation in your brain and in your heart and in other organ systems, it can lead to problems, chronic medical conditions, and also early death. When we look at the social determinants of health, we think about the structural drivers of these social determinants. When we talk about social determinants, what social factors can contribute to the health inequity of our patient? Housing, neighborhoods, education, health, economic stability. Those are all impacted by strategic structures that have been put in laws and policies that have been placed to keep people of color on an inferior run. So some social justice, right? So we want our social workers to really be social justice warriors. Social justice just simply means we gotta respect the rights of everybody because they're human beings, right? And they should have access to privileges and resources equally, not based on race, not based on socioeconomic status. They deserve to have that. And social justice is the order of the day for that. There are 4 principles of social justice, which includes human rights, access to care and services, participation, and also equity. You know, human rights, the goal of it is to protect and to respect everyone's human rights. We all deserve that, just by being born here. So when we talk about equality versus equity, we've seen this image before. Equality just means giving people all the same things so that maybe they can achieve the same outcome. That's not what we're talking about. We ain't trying to do equality. We're into equity. And that's giving people what they need so that they can all have the same outcome. So everybody on the equity side, regardless of their height, are able to see above the fence and are able to see the game. But when we consider justice, so there's this invisible fence that is raised for some people and lowered for others. That is oppression, racism, and discrimination. Some people, not only because of their height, but also because of obstacles or barriers in social structures, prevent them from having access to a privilege. So a justice-informed equity process is what's necessary, and that's what I'm encouraging you to do today. When we take a look at social justice, it not only focuses on racial equity or racial justice, which we've been talking a lot about, but also gender equality, making sure women get paid the same as men, LGBTQ plus rights, having access to affirming treatment and services, being able to get jobs, and Affordable Care Act, right? Affordable health care, having everyone to get access to health care can help everyone. So the characteristics of a social justice warrior, just simply be humble, be open to learning from your patients, learning about the systems that impact them. The humility is powerful. We are a humble people, which is how we've been able to survive despite the generations of oppression and slavery in this country. So I'm humble, I have to tell you. I'm not an expert, although Jeff said I'm an expert. I'm just sharing knowledge and information. And hopefully you can use that to really serve the public, which I think we all decided that we wanted to do with our lives. It's a lifelong process. We don't stop. I'm still learning. And you should continue to learn too and evolve. Equity work and social justice is important for us to acknowledge slavery, racism, and bias, accept it, but figure out mitigation strategies to dismantle it and to decrease it, and making sure that we do an assessment and an adaptation of whatever policies we'll put in place to dismantle racism. Again, a Jedi, right? We don't often see this kind of Jedi, but this is a real Jedi. He's the real deal. He's anti-racist, justice-informed, equity-driven, empowers diversity, and always unabashedly and unapologetically enforces inclusion. When we take a look at structural competency, they're trying to get it. Not if it's coming, it's coming. When we take a look at structural competency, we have to consider the social drivers to why someone is here today. I'm saying it over and over again because what I learned in medical school is that if you hear it often enough, You're gonna believe it? And I know through history and through life, if I see it often enough, I began to believe it. I began to believe that black people were bad and dangerous and violent. And that's what my supervisors at NYU were trying to tell me. That's what my medical education instructors were trying to tell me. When I was doing my residency and fellowship training, they're like, you can't connect with the patient. You can't do therapy with a person with psychosis, a person who comes from rikers or Sing Sing or additive. Just give them the medication. And the reason that they said that is because they are not connected to the community. They have no proximity to the community. But we do, and you have a duty to really provide your patients with what they need in order for them to thrive. My supervisors, they didn't necessarily do that, but I learned, and I know much better now, and now I go back and teach them, I educate them, and then I'm trying to inspire you guys to do the same in whatever system that you're in. So housing is so bad. Housing is a main driver of the social determinants of health. Where you live, your zip code determines what you have access to. Has anyone ever heard of planned shrinkage before? Planned shrinkage, you heard of that back there? All right, it happened in the Bronx. The state government and real estate people decided, you know what? We're gonna burn these Black and Latinx housing projects and houses, burn them out in the 1970s because we wanna repurpose this area. We're gonna remove all the firehouses, remove kind of like the health clinics in the area. So when we set the Bronx on fire, the people won't have no access to services to help them. They did that in the Bronx, but they also did it in Brooklyn, all right, in 1976. So when your people are coming in, distressed, no housing, I don't wanna live in no residence, just send me to the shelter, I wanna live on the streets, you know why? Because the government took advantage of them and put them out of their home. So they say, I'd rather live on the street, on the land, like our people from the motherland. You have to remember that. The criminal legal structure is really important for us to be aware of. Anytime a patient comes into your office setting or into your hospital, you gotta look and figure out if they're having any legal problems. It's not just to put it on a piece of paper and as a screening. It's really so that you can advocate for your patient. If your patient has warrants, if your patient is facing charges, figure out how to connect them with the legal aid, pro bono lawyers, or provide them with legal advice so that they can take care of these legal problems. And tell them that working on their mental wellness treatment might help them so that they won't engage in this criminal activity again. That's how you get people's buy-in and motivational currency. Again, residential segregation, we talked about redlining, education. I can tell you about drug use. We can talk about the opioid epidemic, opioid crisis. So in the 1960s and 70s, when Bumpy Johnson, and the mob was slinging heroin in the Black and Latinx communities, they called these people addicts, and they criminalized their addiction. And the only type of treatment that they were afforded was methadone. You go to a methadone clinic at 5 o'clock in the morning, get your bottle, and you come back the next day, do it all over again, 5:30. That's a problem. In the 1990s, in the white suburban communities, they were given opioids as well. So they were given Percocet, Oxycontin, Loratab, and they became addicted to that. And they said, oh my God, our young white suburbanites, they're dying of opioid overdose. We gotta do something about it. They're very different from those vagabonds who were in the Bronx and in Harlem who was using heroin. So we come up with a different treatment. They came up with buprenorphine. Buprenorphine was the answer for the white suburbanite who was addicted to opioids. You don't have to go to a methadone clinic to get this treatment. You can go to your private doctor's office. And so the white suburbanite went to the private practitioner, got a 7-day supply of medication, 2 week, 3 week, a month supply of medicine, and they didn't have to stay up at a clinic, and it was life-saving. In the United States, they decided not to put buprenorphine, Subutex, Suboxone out to major medical clinics. But in France, they did. In the 1990s, France said, oh, this is a public health problem for everyone. We're gonna make Suboxone available to anyone who wants it. They went to primary care clinics, hospitals, ambulatory care clinics, and if you had an opioid addiction, you could get Suboxone. As a result of that, France rolling out Suboxone, the overdose deaths decreased by 88% in 4 to 5 years. Can you imagine? It went down 88% there. In America, it went up and killed Black and brown people. So housing, access to clinics, access to services contributes to the death of our people. I just want to, as I'm closing, because it's 11 o'clock, I know, I just want to really highlight leaving the brick and mortar of whatever clinic or facility that you're in. And for communities of color specifically, partnering with trusted entities in the community. So there are faith-based organizations who do great work. They connect with the people. They provide wellness education for the congregants. And we can lend our skill and expertise to faith-based organizations. There's one, the Triumph Research Study. It stands for Transforming Your Mental Health Through Prayer and Healing. It's a project led up by one of my colleagues, Dr. Sidney Hankerson, who was at Columbia, but now at Mount Sinai. And he's working with Columbia. And he's working with 12 faith-based organizations in Harlem, in New York City. As a matter of fact, one of the churches that I attend is part of this program. And what they're doing is they are training congregants to be health workers that can help identify depression and anxiety with people and connect them to mental health providers. And that's the kind of work that we need to do, partner with organizations that are doing that type of work. If you go onto the website, you can look at any resource that's available in each borough. And just, you know, these last few slides is really about helping people to heal from racialized trauma. We can pitch that one. All basically is giving people an opportunity to have a safe space to speak about the discrimination and the racism and prejudice, giving them the language to describe what it is, and then giving them tools to figure out how to manage it and access the health services they need. There's another one. I don't know who still got cards up. Okay. All right. I just want to remind you, anti-racist work is important. Shame work for our patients is important. Not hiding the shame, but putting it out there, and not keeping it secret. It's very important. Okay. Somebody thought they got a C. All right. So social workers and social justice warriors, very important for you to fight for the cause. Use anti-racist strategies, try to reduce implicit bias. There is this Dr. Patricia Devine. She's in Wisconsin. She's doing a lot of work about breaking the habit of bias. Get a chance to take a look at her work. It's excellent. She talks about some of the cognitive distortions that people might have that contributes to bias, and also figuring out some strategies to break it. Community integration is important for our patients. Okay, so I'm gonna let her go on. Okay. Faith-based organizations, I can't tell you enough about that. So OMH, so we work for OMH, has been working on health equity initiatives. And we have a chief diversity officer, his name is Matthew Knudsen, and he holds a lot of groups and think tanks to figure out how OMH can be at the forefront of dismantling anti-Black racism within the healthcare delivery system. They put out some information that went out around the state about the mental health effects of racism. So it is an institution that's acknowledging that racism is contributing to the mental health demise of many people, and talk about how to cope with it. They're also promoting the Black Youth Suicide for suicide prevention. There are healing circles. Has anyone ever attended a healing circle? There's a Salabona healing circle that's up in Buffalo. It's available virtually. Project Hope, Vital Science Dashboard, those are all things that OMH is working on. And as Jeff was talking about stigma, stigma is interwoven really into the healthcare delivery system. OMH has some stigma busting tactics that we're all learning about and figuring out how to be very effective at doing it. Just an acknowledgement of people that I've connected with over time with this issue. Keep calm, and a Jedi, you will be And that's all good for now. Thank you, everybody.